Welcome to Mystara for a promised video, where we are taking the War on All Sides timeline 25 years into the future to see what's going on in 1030 AC. I'm breaking this video up into parts as it was running way long after just 3 nations, so I'm sticking with 5 nations per video, with maybe a master cut later. The wars ravaging the continent have long since faded, and new rivalries and old grudges remain. Many previous leaders have shuffled off their mortal coil, and new ones have arisen to replace them, or in one specific case, has returned from the grave to reclaim his title. Time to update the calendar. I'm Mr. Welch, and hold on tight, we're advancing the plot. Goes without saying, this is all speculation and just a product of my own imagination. You'll need to read War on All Sides over on the Vaults of Pandius to see what happened during the wars between Hul and Darrakan and the grand throwdown that was the Wizards' War. I wanted to fix the numerous continuity problems caused by Wrath of the Immortals, and keep the Cold War vibe that the aftermath of that box set destroyed. When you get rid of all the villains, you get rid of all the fun. There will be a lot of people dying in this video, mainly through the passage of time. Lady Marilyn was supposed to be not long for the world in the first gazetteer, along with a host of other elderly types, yet all of them were fine and dandy in the Karameikos box set 10 years later, including the guy whose central plot point was he was on the brink of death. I will address each nation's changes in history in release order, as that's easiest for me. That means we are starting with the Kingdom of Karameikos, now ruled over by Queen Adriana, as her parents died of natural causes a few years back. King Stefan was a good king and was grieved by Traladarn and Thaetian alike when he passed in his sleep at 76. Adriana was well prepared for her ascent and has ruled capably during the few years she has reigned. She is a widow. Her husband Devon was the minister of the navy who was lost at sea during a particularly fierce storm. She has 2 sons, Lucian, the crown prince, and Argent. She did cause a bit of a scandal when she struck up a relationship with the Ethengar ambassador Subutai, a friend from her youth, after her husband's death. Karameikos has prospered since the wars. It has survived largely intact, suffering briefly from a blockade before the Ierendi fleet was unleashed on the master's pitiful excuse for a navy. Because of this, the merchants grew rich, supplying trade routes and raw materials to help Thyatis, Darrakan, and the 5 Shires rebuild. The primary point of contention in the nation is still between the ruling Karameikos family and the von Hendriks, though now the tension lies in the grown-up children. Ludwig von Hendriks was slain fighting humanoids when his strength finally failed him in old age. His son Frederick has become the new count, and while he lacks his father's martial talent, his skill in blackmail and espionage benefited him greatly. Adriana has appointed her brother Justin to serve as the Minister of Finance, a position he has excelled at. He's always had a head for numbers, and under his guidance, the kingdom's coffers have swelled. The quick-witted Vaylin Karameikos was appointed to be the ambassador of Thyatis, a crucial position considering the strained relationship between the once closely allied nations. Their shared history, desire to repair their strained relationship, and Vaylin's natural charm has returned the 2 countries to friendly terms, but not as symbiotic as they once were. The 2 remaining children of the von Hendriks line have done well for themselves. Amelie married an adventurer who claimed the Marilyn estate when the elderly curmudgeon died under mysterious circumstances. The culprit was never found, but considering the list of people who didn't want to see her dead consisted of approximately 3 gnomes who hadn't heard of her, nobody really complained. The adventurer died a decade later of plague, leaving the matron of the von Hendriks clan in power near the capital. Otto von Hendriksley, surprisingly, is the peacemaker between the 2 families due to his natural skill in military matters. The youngest von Hendriks served in the kingdom's armed forces during his shearing, and acquitted himself well during his service at Castellan Keep. He has little patience for people he considers soft, but is a father to his men when they impress him. Adriana appointed him Minister of Defense as a peace offering between the 2 families, and this gamble has paid off. Otto provides for his troops, though his stern demeanor for those who have never served in the army is off-putting to other ministers. He butts heads with Justin Karameikos quite often, as Justin considers Otto a bully, while Otto considers the finance minister as naive to the world outside the city walls. Other events in Karameikos have seen Master Terrari become the Minister of Magic, though he plans to retire in a few years to finish his quest for immortality. He's one of Adriana's most trusted advisors, and it was his idea to play Otto and Justin off of each other. He thinks their competition drives them both to improve the lives of the citizens. The Radu family finally fell after the death of Anton Radu. His grandsons tried to keep the Veiled Society going, but didn't have Anton's experience or gift of subterfuge. Eventually, the family was exposed and finally put down. The religious split threatened with Patriarch Jowet's death never manifested. Alfred Oderbree's attempted coup was stopped early when his followers blanched at the thought of bloodshed between members of the faith. The cult of Halav has largely faded into memory with the death of King Stefan. He's still well regarded with certain members of the clergy, but the organized worship of him has stopped. As far as Bargle goes, he's still out there somewhere being Bargle. The conflicts you're going to find in 2030 Karameikos are primarily internal. Internationally, they're well liked by just about everybody. They've even smoothed over their relations with Thyatis after years of tension. The power struggle remains between the royal family and the von Hendriks, but it's well hidden and behind the scenes. The two remaining significant religions still butt heads frequently, but there's nothing more than just the occasional shouting match. The Iron Ring is mainly extinct, replaced by von Kessler agents who prefer to obtain slaves without resorting to raids. Ylaruam is a nation coming into its own because of the dedication of Sultan Ahmed ibn Said. He consolidated power after the Year of Four Sultans, and he dedicated all of his time trying to return the waters of Ylaruam. He couldn't restore the rains, as he didn't know that it was magic that stole it from his land in the first place. The elves couldn't be reached for comment. He contracted multiple adventurers to find the underground Nithian River, an expedition that took years. Behind the scenes, he employed numerous high-level wizards, dervishes, and clerics to return the river above ground. If his use of foreign arcane magic had been discovered, he would have been disgracefully overthrown. But with the river now flowing through the mountains past Ylaruam's city and out into the ocean, Ylaris have reacted with pride at this creation, which they accredit to Al-Kalim. The return of the river Nithia has created several unforeseen problems, starting first with Ibn Said stepping down from the Sultanate to quest for immortality. The nation went through several sultans in the next few decades, mostly taking on the position at an advanced age and dying a few years later. The current sultan, Ahmed ibn Falan, is a member of the Kin faction and has turned Ylaruam isolationist while they dedicate all their attentions to infrastructure. In the process, he's had to deal with increased raids from the Nithian tribesmen, cystic war parties, and reavers coming down from the shattered Solderford Jarldoms. He's also discovered the truth about the creation of the river Nithia, but he hides that from everyone. Ibn Said is considered a lock for immortality by the Yalari, and anyone disparaging him will not be tolerated. The threats facing Ylaruam are both internal and external. People are more united than ever, but the brigands and humanoids from the deep desert or mountain strongholds are gaining more confidence as the new settlements are harder to defend. There has been an effort made to wipe out the Cystic and drive the Nithians from their homes, but there hasn't been any real threat to them. With the breakup of the Solderford Jarldoms, pirates and reavers are becoming a common sight across a large chunk of the northern coastal region. The wizard Barrymore has seen the river routed right by his project, something that he does not approve of in the slightest. While he hasn't raised his hand at the newcomers, he has set up several landings on the river for merchants shipping goods. He's torn, as he despises visitors, but the merchants are more than happy to pay him a lot of money to provision them before they move on. Glantri has seen the most change of all the nations, having barely avoided a full-blown civil war more than once. It has added a host of new princes, but lost others along the way. They've become even more shunned through their use of magics forbidden in other lands, which has only hurt the poor as the high-level wizards can provide for themselves. Glantri has strained its relationship with Darakin, but is on friendly terms with Karameikos and Alfheim. There's a very short list of allies, and their list of enemies hasn't narrowed at all since the Wizard War 30 years ago. With the discovery of the Radiance by the Immortals, many of the Brotherhood of Rad have gone into hiding or been slain. One side effect of having the Crucible feed on negative energies was to reduce the length of the day without magic. Every year, the day was shortened by a few minutes from the previous year. As it stands now, the day without magic is barely 4 hours long, an event that Glantrians still dread. Because of the drain, necromantic magic is becoming increasingly more difficult, and the two undead princes haven't been seen in the capital for years. The first Glantrian Civil War nearly occurred during a power struggle between Sin the Night Dragon in her guise as Dolores Hillsbury and her numerous supporters, versus the new Averron faction of Richard and Isidore, with their allies Malachi du Moray and Quinildor Erawan. Sin had used her entropic powers to ensnare Princes von Drachenfell and Di Malapietra, along with her toady High Doge Cole, and were poised to expel the Erawan elves from Glantri, calling for a vote to settle the matter once and for all. Sin's faction won the vote by the narrowest of margins, only for a surprise delegate to appear. The long-missing Etienne d'Amberville returned without any fanfare, simply walking through the door and sitting in his old chair. He then cast his vote in favor of his brother and sister-in-law, changing the result to their position. An outraged Hillsbury called Etienne an impostor and demanded his immediate execution. D'Amberville countered this by casting a spell, forcing Hillsbury to assume her true form, that of the Night Dragon Sin. This shocked a great deal of the assembled delegates, who in the space of a few minutes had seen the return of the most powerful Glantrian prince, and the revelation of Sin's actual nature. Before anyone could react, Sin lunged in all of her draconic fury at Etienne, who cast another spell, exploding the dragon all over Parliament and its delegates. This threw Glantri into absolute chaos as the power balance of the nation shifted with a single spell. Most of Sin's closest allies claimed to have no knowledge of her true form and were offered a chance to step down from their positions in exchange for leniency. Except for High Doge Cole, who was set upon by the werewolves, who were led by the elven Lord Quinildor. Sigmund von Drachenfels took over for his father and moved Ritterberg's focus away from dragons and more into artifice. The boy was well known for lacking skill in building magic devices, so a not small cadre of gnomes were hired to instruct him further. Prince Di Malapietra consulted with his family to decide who was the most qualified to take over control of the province. due to a slight miscalculation on the waiter over which goblin wasn't poisoned. When the first toast was done, the prince, his brothers Giovanni and Augustina, and his sister Lucretia were found face down on the table, with only his 12-year-old son Bartolomeo alive. There was a significant juggling of seats due to the sudden death or abdication of many princes and nobility. Bartolomeo was raised by his mother with the help of Antonio di Taranto, a family ally and alleged member of the Pragmati. Despite the boy's young age and the lethal history of his family, he survived into adulthood as any potential rivals developed a rather strange habit of dying in an unexpected yet plausibly deniable fashion. This isn't to say Corinth is a safe place to do politics. If you weren't the prince or his inner council, your odds of surviving to old age have not improved. With Sin dead, Black Hill was left without a prince for the second time in less than a decade. With both of the deceased Prince Volaspin's children underage and politically isolated because of the machinations of Sin, the position was offered to Count Ameth Erbal, a longtime ally of House Silverstone. The new prince is more obsessed with air magics than running his new domain. Still, he delegates well and is popular with the rest of Parliament, simply because he has little political interest outside his studies. Volaspin's two children both covet the throne despite their young age, and are looking for ways to send the new prince plummeting from the sky. On accident, of course. The two undead princes both suffered greatly, with the crucible now draining negative energy to power it. This heavily impacted Prince MacGregor because of his use of the Radiance, something Prince Volosny didn't do. Both princes were also steadfast opponents of the policy allowing clerics into Glantri to deal with the undead menace caused during the war with Alphatia, where the necromantic princes were unleashing hordes of undead to try to turn back the Alphatian monsters and the various rebel groups that were empowered by the war. MacGregor disappeared one night without warning. There was a loud boom, and when his guards broke down his magically sealed door, they found signs of an explosion, but no MacGregor. Prince Volosny, a month later, was found slain on top of his tower with his head cut from his shoulders and a stake through his heart. There are no suspects officially, but the next day at noon, Claude d'Amberville appeared in the town square of Igorov, calling on its population to throw down their undead lords. With the death or disappearance of two more Glantrian princes, the nation almost broke into another civil war. In the case of Brandt MacGregor, he left explicit instructions in case of his death or disappearance that his grandson Angus would become the prince, despite Angus being underage. He is helped by his two uncles, who try to influence the boy to become a better ruler than Branart, but Angus stopped being a child years ago. Interestingly enough, the clerics trying to clean up the undead problem in Clantyr have felt a great disturbance. Omens and portents indicate a new player in the heavens who is yet to reveal himself. The death of Prince Morfel Gorovich Vozlazny left a massive power vacuum in Moldavia, as his undead thralls found themselves free to claim the princedom for themselves. It hasn't helped that the newly restored Claude d'Amberville has led a force of paladins into the province looking for undead. Claude's wife Titania was freed from Volosny's control and begged her husband to restore her humanity, as his family did for him. Claude used all of his influence to convince his father to wish his wife back to life, and now he's on a rampage of revenge against his former masters. When the flames died down, the cruel Mikhail Vozlazny was the last vampire standing. The rest of the principalities are relatively stable compared to the turmoil of the ones just mentioned. Kandahar remained neutral, but pounced when Ritterberg was disgraced because of their involvement with Sin. Because of this, they created the Principality of Skullhaven, with Ermahid Krinigar as the new prince. Likewise, House Alhambra took advantage of the death of Prince Velarden to have Donna de Montebello named Princess of Oxhill. The fourth principality was given to Harold Hoskins, who was given Sablestone on pure merit, a rarity in Glantrian politics. Prince Carlotino joined House Salaire to reward Malachi du Marais for opposing Sin with the last of the new principalities, Morlaix. It is known he is a werewolf and is allowed to rule without interference as other lycanthropes flock to the new domain where they won't be hunted indiscriminately. Etienne's return, as outlined in the module Mark of Amber, has turned Glantrian politics on its ear, but he's happy to sit quietly in his chair and watch the deadly politics take place around him. Glantri was always known for its internal strife, and it's only gotten worse. Sin is dead, but Errolwan still lies half-raised by the humanoid attacks. Half the princes are dead or deposed, and the new leaders range from out of their element to worse than their predecessors. There's 5 new principalities, many of whom serve as second votes for their sponsoring house. No one outside of Glantri trusts the mages, and for good measure. The nation hasn't changed to what it is. They are still the same backstabbing, xenophobic, pragmatic wizards. It's just now they're under new management. And 15 princes can argue amongst each other much better than 10 princes. Ierendi has reached its crossroads. The island nation tried to avoid joining the wars on the mainland, but the collective conscience of its people just couldn't stand by and watch the slaughter. Unleashing their ships turned the tide of the War of the Master, allowing troops to land behind Julian forces, cut supply lines, and liberate cities. The hybrid of former pirates and Toa Makai made for a frightening sight on the battlefield. When the war was over, the nation had to stop and think about its next step. They couldn't remain isolationists. Either they would be drawn into the larger war because they were a threat, or they couldn't stand back and watch their allies suffer. Ierendi decided, after much debate, to do what they could to make the seas safer, not just for their ships, but for all nations. They have started patrols to hunt down humanoid raiders, especially the Kara, and purge them from the various tropical islands. Piracy has become much rarer because of the Ierendi patrols. A general amnesty was offered in the nation for pirates before the nations hunted down the various offenders. A week after the country made its offer for any pirate to give up a life of buccaneer, a massive fleet of pirate ships arrived in Mad Cree's Cove outside of Ierendi City. Every alarm was sounded and the guard was roused, but then the most unexpected thing happened. The pirates surrendered. They claimed amnesty and offered to become privateers for the nation. The fleet accounted for over 90% of the pirates operating in the country. The offer was accepted, and their first task was to hunt down the remaining 10% that didn't take the amnesty. Ierendi's biggest concern was unifying its people into a single nation. Refugees had flooded into Ierendi after the war, as it was one of the few nations untouched by it. They were largely content with their diversity, but the new immigrants caused several incidents that threatened the harmony. After much debate and negotiation, Honor Island agreed to give up its sovereignty and become a single people. Multiple concessions were made, and the island was still perilous if you weren't native to it because of all the fire-related creatures. It's considered private property, but now contributed to the defense of Ierendi officially. There's a bit of unease with the creatures that arrive from the island unannounced currently. Still, the first time orc raiders were repulsed by a trio of fire giants serving in the nation's army, everybody realized the arrangement could work. Ierendi has spent the last 3 decades unifying its people to work together as Ierendi. They were no longer former convicts, Makai, dwarves, Honor Islands, halfling refugees, or albinos, or even the newly arrived Sind, Derrican, and Trugan refugees. But they were the Ierendi. Multiple agreements have been made to gain the full support of all the different people, and now they have to take part in the nation. The Ierendi Council now includes a single representative of the albinos of Outer Island, along with a dwarven spokesman. The refugees and their descendants were given cursory representation as well. Only the cursed White Island isn't represented for apparent reasons. Ierendi doesn't have a lot of issues as a nation. They're trying to be a player abroad with their anti-pirate monster patrols, but have no imperial thoughts, and they're on good terms with every country with a port. Internally, their primary issues are economic ones. With the rise of the trading powers of Vestland and Salishan, Ierendi's resort industry is becoming taxed with the number of visitors. The nation realizes there can be too much of a good thing. Especially after the war, many refugees have tried to settle in the islands, which put a strain on the nation's resources. Decades later, there is still some resentment for the refugees who arrived, claiming the war destroyed their homes, but when their country was rebuilt, they decided to stay. The War of the Master and the internal strife in Glantri have dramatically impacted Alfheim. While the elven homeland didn't see any of the Master's troops step foot in their forest, they fought in multiple battles and lost quite a few men in the war's later stages. They expected compensation from Derrican, but with the devastation brought on by the Master's forces, the elves realized that that wasn't coming anytime soon. But what concerns them the most is the nation of New Angmor that has claimed the Broken Lands. Despite being neighbors for decades now, the Sylvan elves still don't trust their Shadow Elf cousins, and the feeling is mutual. What makes matters worse is the Canalbarth and the Angmor Forest drew closer to each other despite the best efforts of both elven nations, and now cover the Inlashar region of Derrican. The trees don't intermingle. When you cross from the green trees to the blue trees, you've entered the other forest. While there hasn't been any open conflict between the elves, a few raids have taken place by both sides to test each other's mettle. Deaths are rare on these raids. It's more of a show of force than an actual force. Both sides are treated like bandits if caught, but even then they're more likely to be ransomed than lynched. King Doriath stepped down after 200 years of rule to pursue his quest for immortality. It's rumored that his immortal patron gave him an ultimatum, and the Elf King decided that he served his nation long enough. Doriath has just recently stepped down. He's been pondering the decision for decades after the return of the Shadow Elves. He's yet to pick a successor, as there are numerous candidates, but none stand out from the others. Whoever he chooses must be brought up to speed on the diplomatic Cold War between the elves before they even look at the throne. While the elves are insular, their entire attention has been devoted across the Insular to their cousins. Attitudes range from optimism for Clan Chosa merchants to outright hatred for the militant Clan Red Arrow. Relations are cool, but there is some conversation. Derrican doesn't want a total war going on with them in the crossfire. King Doriath has met multiple times with Queen Tanadelio to try to improve relations. It doesn't help that these two can barely stand each other. He thinks that she has eyes for his throne. She sees him as a Derrican puppet. It would probably be better for all involved to let diplomats handle the negotiations, but the elven rulers refuse to delegate this task. That wraps up part 1. I won't lie, I honestly thought I could do this as a single video. Then I realized I was almost 5 minutes into Karameikos and that the whole video was going to be huge. So, 17 nations, plus the Crucibles, and dipping into surrounding areas like the Hollow World, Savage Coast, and the Serpent Peninsula, I decided to split this up into different parts, 4 or 5 at the most, I hope. Glantri was obviously the tough one, but I still have so much more to do. When I'm done, I will try to splice this together to make one huge video. But until then, remember, time keeps on slipping into the future.